Hey folks, you're listening to the Idea Roastery. I'm Herman.
And I'm Jason.
Jason, do you use spreadsheets for anything?
I use spreadsheets a lot. Um, I use them for little things every now and again when I'm like trying to calculate at what point I'm going to become a millionaire. I use it for, grocery lists sometimes. I use it for little sort of back of the napkin kind of style calculations. If I want to, you know, run something on AWS and I want to calculate how much it's going to cost me, I use it for that. Um, Yeah, I'm a big fan of the spreadsheet actually. Um, I remember once I did like a work at university you get like a bit of work experience during your holidays. So I worked at this one construction company and I basically built them like an Excel like a phone directory. Yeah. And I before I kind of knew about Excel, I knew some of the things, but then that was the first time I looked at like basic and like diving into like creating like functions and stuff like that and VLOOKUPs and that was like one of my sort of biggest Excel projects. I don't know how useful it was at the end. It did work. It like you could like put in, people's back then it was like, what internet was like around, but didn't really have like Facebook or like internal sort of tools. So it kind of worked. And then when I was at AWS, one of my colleagues introduced me to the pivot table. I don't know if you ever used that. Um, so basically, you can take data and basically just like sort of analyze it in terms of groups. So you can like
hmm
group by columns and rows and then count in certain ways. And that was also a game changer for my Excel spreadsheets.
It sounds like your holiday job had you excelling at Excel. Sounds like whether whether it was useful for the company or not, it certainly became useful for you later on.
Yeah. But I also I use Google Sheets a little bit more now, and it's actually becoming it's like quite powerful actually because you can do things like doing lookups on like stock prices or certain things. Not that I manage a lot of stocks on there, but it's like becoming a lot sort of more powerful.
hmm
And then there are certain features that I've just never used,
No, no,
which I'm sure
completely.
somebody
Is I,
has.
I use Google Sheets fairly exclusively. I've fiddled around with Pages because I'm more of a Mac native, but I've been using Google Sheets for so long that it's hard to go and relearn all the functions and how everything fits together. But I do definitely think that knowing how to wrangle spreadsheets properly is a superpower, right? Is being able to take information and modify it and extrapolate information from that or extrapolate knowledge from that information is so very useful. And it boggles my mind that very few people actually do this. I've got, 10, 20 Google Sheets that I use on a regular basis. And every now and then I'll be having a conversation with someone and I'll be like, oh yeah, I've got a sheet this actually happened on Friday. I was at my girlfriend's brother's birthday party and I was having a chat with a guy and we started talking about retirement annuities. And I was making the case that actually a self-managed portfolio or just investing in broad market index funds has a higher return on investment over your entire lifetime, despite not having any tax benefits over getting a retirement annuity, which does, based purely on the fact that retirement annuities in South Africa have to invest 51% onshore, which limits their returns. And so he's like, okay, okay. And I'm like, no. So I actually created a spreadsheet about this. And I like went and I ran him through my spreadsheet that takes into account like capital gains tax and the preferential tax rates on retirement annuities, et cetera, et cetera.
Was this while you were having a chat?
Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, let's see over here. And the guy like looks
Nice.
down at this, he looks up at me and he's like, you are so much smarter than me. And I'm like, no, dog, it's just that I like I know how to use spreadsheets. And that's kind of it, is that like you can make very accurate deductions given, obviously given the right information going in, garbage in, garbage out, um, as well as just knowing how to set up a couple of basic formulas. I do my personal finance stuff on there. I have a couple of things that do the finances for my two companies, Just Sketch Me and Bear. And I feel like Excel or Google Sheets or any of these tabulated processors are they are definitively programming tools when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it. But they're just so accessible. Like they're the original no-code tool, and they're just, in my personal opinion, the most useful no-code tool because they do all the things that all these other no-code tools do, except for make fancy interfaces.
Hmm. Do you think it's something that is going to stick around as like a thing you need to know? Because I think if you look at what's happening online and on the internet, a lot of people are creating sort of AI and automation around their data sets. Um, do you think it's something that some people are going to have to know? Because I know people who don't know Excel that well, and so maybe they just never need to learn it.
So most people don't know how to use Excel, right? And most people are never going to learn it. However, I still posit that knowing it is significantly better than not knowing it. Um, there's also a secondary thing that like AI tools and opaque um, data transformations don't have that Excel does, and that is its transparency, right? So you can go onto Grok and you can plug in all of your let's call it your personal finance information over there, and it can do some processing for you, and it can spit out a couple of numbers, and you can say, oh, okay, that's cool, and I can try and explain those numbers to you, and you can go, okay, that's cool. But when you have them in tabulated format and you can see how X turns into Y and how the projection works over time and when you're going to hit your savings goals or your, retirement goals, et cetera, is firstly, you understand the data a lot better, but you also understand how you got from point A to point B. Whereas just relying on an AI tool to tell you, you kind of just have to trust it, but you don't really know how it got there.
But if the outcome is to just know the number, like what's the point of having an understanding of the data? Like if you because you could just ask your second question to the AI, it could be like your next question. Like what is it about knowing the underlying data structure that like gives you more of a benefit than just getting the answer?
Oh, completely. Like, that's a whole philosophical conversation around whether understanding is actually important. The whole thing like, should you learn how to do mathematics in the age of the calculator,
Mm.
right? Is like, most people don't need to learn how to do linear algebra. But knowing how to do linear algebra can be useful depending on what it is you do.
But for us that we don't know, we maybe don't know like linear like differential equations like to a high degree.
Yeah.
Would you say the same like for something like that where it's like uh I don't necessarily know how they work, but I will offload them to a machine and to just give me the answer? Or would you expect that the some machine will give you some sort of coaching to kind of get you there?
That's a really good question, and I think, at least to me, the answer comes in around how much impact does it have on my life? Because if it has a lot of an impact on my life, is I do want to understand it. Differential equations don't play a very big role in my life. However, my personal
I mean,
finances do.
they're in physics. I
I
think
mean, okay,
maybe unbeknownst to you, they do. But
unbeknownst to me.
yeah.
But like you could say the same thing about like health, right? You can just ask ChatGPT questions about what supplements should I take. But if you don't necessarily understand the mechanisms that happen over there, is you could not be providing the right context to the AI. You might get, recommendations that don't chill with your lifestyle or with your existing medications, et cetera, et cetera. And so knowing what's important and understanding the context, I think will definitely improve your life. Whether everyone has to do it is a moot point. Most people won't. Most people don't take a deep interest in the things that they do. But I do think that the more interest you give to topics that are important to you, the richer you
Mm.
will be, both literally and metaphorically.
There's this interesting concept that I've kind of been dipping my toe into, and it's around graph databases and graph knowledge or knowledge bases, right? And it's this idea of like, I think they call them ontologies. So where you can have different, you've got the same data, but you've got different perspectives on the data. So for instance, when you've got your sort of spreadsheet, you've got like rows which represent, I guess, some sort of entity or some sort of event that happened. And then similar to like how I was talking about a pivot table, you can basically like re-augment to look at the data from a perspective. So like it might be like, what are the connections between, the events and how much money you got paid and or, you might be interested in that sort of connection, but you're not necessarily interested in like, how the event like was emitted from your system, right? So there's like kind of two different viewpoints of seeing data or seeing the same underlying structure. And I found that quite interesting because it kind of like points to this sort of idea of like, different perspective having like different qualities of understanding, right? Because if I'm a finance person, I'm looking at the data from one lens and I only care about like sort of the spreadsheets. But maybe if I'm a DevOps person, I'm looking at it from a point of view of like, how many errors or how many like, what's the, different, you know, response codes or whatever. Um, and so it's like kind of the same data, but different perspectives.
That's interesting. I think that that's also one of the useful things about data visualization is that my spreadsheets all tend to have, graphs and pie charts and stuff tucked into them just because, you can take a look at the data in one representation just being the hard numbers, and then you can take a look at it as a graph of a time or a pie chart. And in a way that is, still you, it's still your perspective, but based on how you're looking at it, it has different meanings and context. And so, similar but different to what you're
Hmm.
describing over there.
Yeah. Do you think in the future, I guess, or maybe the fairly sort of close future, like AI systems will play more of a part in terms of that, figuring out stuff that you don't find interesting, or like finding more
100%.
more connection? Because for instance, like in your spreadsheet, you might be looking at a certain graph, but you're not aware of this other connection somewhere
Yeah.
else.
Well, here's the thing, right? Is that in the very near future, you could argue that, the newest state-of-the-art model I think right now is Grok 4, and it's really good. You could argue that it's, better at doing my personal finances than I am. I'm quite certain if I went and I fed my entire personal finance spreadsheet into it, it would find a couple of assumptions or mistakes that I'd made here and there and correct them. Um, so theoretically, in the near future, I could just plug my information into it, and it wouldn't be I don't want to say the word better, but it wouldn't be necessary for me to have a deep understanding of that information. I could just trust the output, right? Um, I still don't have the confidence to do that, but as these AI systems become more pervasive and they do become more reliable as time goes on, we're going to check them less and less because they require checking less and less up until such a point that we just trust exactly what they say. And you know what? They'll probably be right, and they'll probably be more trustworthy than a financial advisor. Maybe arguably they're already more trustworthy than a financial advisor.
Yeah. But so what do you think that's going to look like from like a bit of a tech perspective? Do you think it's going to be that you just let you connect it up to some SaaS service, like you connect up your Google Sheets to Grok, and then Grok's just going to run in the background, charge your credit card, and then give you insights on like a regular basis and just say like send you an email or
Or
like
just plug it
what
into your
let
bank account. Just plug it into your bank's API and it just gets read access. And it says, okay, you sent some money to this investment platform. You plug in the investment platform's API as well. And it takes a look at your investments. It takes a look at your bank account. At the end of the month, it says, it says like, "Hey, Jason, I see that you're spending a lot of money on coffee. Do you know that you spend 10% of your disposable income on coffee? That's a very silly thing to do. Perhaps make some coffee at home. And also, you have the majority of your investments in this very high risk account. And while it does have the more potential for growth than, say, these other investment types, it may be good to diversify your investments because we don't necessarily know where the market is going to go. And just being safe with at least some of your money is a good idea. I see you're also over indexed in property, so perhaps you don't need to own real estate and also have some REITs. And also, while you're at it, you could keep the excess emergency fund not in your checking account, but in a high yield savings account so that you get that extra 5% per annum if you don't have any emergencies that crop up. And based on just that information, just the information from your investment platform and your bank account, it should be able to make those inferences. I mean, hell, if you gave me access to your bank account, I'd be able to make those inferences for you, or a financial advisor would be able to make those inferences for you. But you know, it's not worth it for me to do it because you'd have to pay me to do that, and then you'd also have to trust me with that data. I guess in this case, you have to trust XAI with that data, but people are trusting XAI with their API keys for every service that they have. So,
So, exactly. But given your like knowledge of how systems are built and like software and development, like how realistic is this? And where does the goals come in? Because obviously you've got a goal of like obviously a lot of people maximize return, right? But it could also be a goal of like minimize effort, right? So where do you plug that in a system that's like it, I guess going into this like agentic world. It's like where would you plug that in? Or is that something that you have as maybe a key card that's connected to your domain name? Or like what like where how are you guiding it? Because I know that in the sort of ether of the internet land, there's like this agent profile kind of thing where it's like it just kind of does stuff for you. But how do you
yeah,
like coach it or how do you
that's
get it to
actually
do what you want?
that's a really interesting question, and not necessarily one that I've thought too hard about. So theoretically, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is the case already. You could have or in some cases, you could have your investment platform of choice have an agent that is better than 99% of humans at making good financial decisions and investing that just handles that for you. Now, the right answer over there is probably to invest in broad market index funds. Right. And if the agent just does that for the vast majority of people, that would probably be a net benefit. Um, but I'd say that it would have to be it would have to be both agentic, but also it would need to be, what would the right word be, like consultative. It still needs to interface with you because you're the one who's making the financial decisions on the consuming part, right? You're the one who's spending all that money on coffee.
I think like there's an interesting concept that someone brought up when I was having a chat the other day. They were like, agents are going to be very similar to how you have for employees, right? So in the same way, so you have like an agent that can kind of it has a broad domain knowledge of, financial advice or, whatever, manufacturing or whatever. It's got this broad sort of space. And then what you would do is when you bring it into your company, and I've looked mostly at the company context. I wouldn't know personally, but like in a company context, you would have it go through the same onboarding, like watch the same videos, like get the same sort of onboarding process as any normal employee. And through that process, it almost like you kind of like train it on your business. And then once it's able to see a couple of examples and you kind of give it, that's maybe where you would like implant it with like some goals. Then over time it would kind of be like a normal like intern. It would be like, do this work and then come back to me and like I'll review it and I'll say, you can tweak this and maybe this would be better or I prefer that. Then it would go back and it would have this data and then over time it would like progressively get better. But it was quite interesting, this idea of like having an AI go through like an onboarding process into your company. And maybe you would have the same for, onboarding into your financial situation.
That's an interesting one. So my Emma, who's just over there, uh, she runs an agency that does advertising, content marketing, the works. And she's recently brought on a new employee who's versed in Zapier, which, if you're unfamiliar, it's an automation tool that allows you to connect disparate services together using their APIs without having to know how to code. I mean, in a sense, it is coding, but it's a visual tool where you say, okay, when a new line is added to or when a new row is added to this Google sheet, then go and fire off an email to this and make a notification on Slack and update this in other service and add it to the accounting software or whatever. Um, Now, I think that in small businesses, right, there is so much untapped potential by just implementing very basic automations. The number of, I mean, just learning how to use Google Sheets to circle all the way back up would go such a long ways. Like understanding cash flow, understanding opportunity cost, I think is another one that people really don't understand. Is like if your business, makes a 10% return on investment, but you work 8 hours a day every day to get that 10% return on investment, it's actually in your best interest to go and invest that money in a high yield savings account instead and find another job. Um, but just, the amount of time that companies spend copying information from service A to service B and sending out emails that are really just summaries of this information to the relevant parties is by using these tools well, you can effectively automate all of that, reduce the cognitive burden on employees, reduce the time they need to spend on administrative tasks, and they can instead add value where they're
They
best at
can
adding
train the
value.
AIs. They can train the AIs. That's where they belong. Just reinforcement learning on whatever the AI does. Like it's like that one thing. It's like you're here just to watch the AIs. Just make sure the AIs don't do anything
Yeah,
weird.
I think I've said it before on the podcast, but it's like the computing systems of the future employ a man and a dog. The dog is there to make sure that the man doesn't touch the computer, and the man is there to feed the dog.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess like when you look online, there's a lot of people talking about agents and like AI systems and like, you know, they go out and especially it seemed to be like the marketing space, maybe just because marketers tend to know how to market and so maybe they're better at amplifying their own sort of voice in this field. But a lot of the time you just look at it, it's just like, like a make.com or Zapier kind of integration, and that's their AI.
Yeah,
Um, do you think that's like, do you think there's a bit of hype in the agent kind of space or the term, or do you think there's actually
a lot
something
of
that's
hype.
going to be, yeah.
No, like so as with any potentially interesting or any interesting emergent tech of late, is it gets absolutely like just blasted out there by marketers trying to get more Twitter followers, et cetera, et cetera. And it's blown entirely out of proportion. That isn't to say that these aren't super useful tools. They absolutely are. But if you take a look at what people who are developing these tools or people who are actually working with these tools are doing, it is very different to what these talking heads on Twitter are doing. These are two different jobs. One of them is using AI tools and figuring out how they fit into workflows. The other one is grow Twitter following, and they need to communicate very differently. I think if I'm sure you're familiar with Andrei Karpathy. As you know, I'm a bit of a fan of his.
Mhm.
Um, he is very knowledgeable about all of this. I mean, he, was one of the big boys at OpenAI and Tesla's AI department, et cetera, et cetera. And if you listen to any of his talks or read any of his work, he's very conservative about the use of these tools, right? Also, I think that the word agent doesn't mean what a lot of people thinks it means. When I hear the term agent, I think this is
FBI,
it
like CIA.
is that it's autonomous, right? It's running in a process that is A, ongoing and non-terminating, right? And B does not necessarily require that much intervention. Whereas I think what a lot of people are calling agents right now are people who are just picking up on the word and they're just using it to refer to a large language model doing something. So they'll say, "Yeah, I went and I built my new SaaS using agents." And what they did is they actually used Claude Code.
Yeah. Well, it's not even like an agent, it's not even a language model that's doing the work. It's kind of like a language model combined with like one of these sort of automation tools. And so maybe it's like scraping from somewhere and then it's like doing some process and then a LLM is like creating the tweet and then it's pushing it into a Twitter. Like I've created a workflow similar to that, to be honest. But it's like I wouldn't call that like an agent. And I think it's maybe people are like a little bit, mixing automation with agents. And I guess to a certain extent, it maybe gets people, typical marketing fashion, it gets people to that edge of like FOMO, fear of missing out, or like feel like they're going to fall behind. And that maybe pushes them to at least have that initial discussion of what's going on. But I do think like there's a lot of incredible stuff happening with AI. And I think the agent space, I feel is still quite early days. There are tools and platforms that are starting to give you this almost like give the language model tools like, hey, you can use these tools. Here's the prompt. And let me know if you want to use one of these tools. And then you go use the tool, you give it back to the prompt, and you basically have like a for loop. This was one of my realizations when I first looked at it. I was like, are agents just for loops? Is it just like a loop? And it basically is. It's
The answer
basically
is
just a
yes.
language model, a loop where there's maybe like some sort of tool use where you basically just like calling the APIs, giving the text response and giving it back to the model. And you just do that infinitely until you either hit like some sort of endpoint or you maybe time out. And so it's kind of like there are tools that are getting into, the market that are like helping to do that. Um, my concern is also like on the cost side, like I guess you're just infinitely expecting, some cloud provider to just use however many tokens you want, kind of thing. So, which to some extent you can balance out with like, well, if it's doing the work of, you know, a normal employee, you've got that employee's salary basically you can use for tokens, and then you're still going to make a gain potentially.
Mm. S- So let me shift gears for a second over here, because I read something fairly interesting the other day that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. So let's assume for a second you have unlimited access to one of these state-of-the-art models, whether it be Grok 4 or uh, Claude 4 Opus, I believe is the big one um, on Anthropic's stuff. So we've um, if you take a look at how humans and especially researchers and other scientists think, is that we don't just sit and think when we're sitting down at the computer doing our work. We think while we're in the shower, we think while we're cutting onions for dinner. And so you have a hard problem and it kind of sits in your mind and it germinates and you figure it out. And then, one day when you're sitting on the toilet, you're like, I figured it out. And off you waddle to go and write an email to your supervisor or whatever. And so if you think about the way that these AI models work currently, is they're kind of like the dude from the movie Memento, where every day he wakes up and it's just erased. He's got amnesia, so everything from yesterday is gone. Everything from all the other days are gone, and so he leaves little notes for himself on his body. But now imagine you had a really, really big context, and some of the contexts are getting really huge, or you just have a really robust note-taking system where you essentially keep an agent alive to work on a problem and just have it selectively iterate on it. So think of it kind of like chain of thought, but without the same time constraints. Because like if I ask Grok a question, I kind of want an answer like at the very least in the next 5 minutes, right? But now instead you give it a difficult problem and you let it loose for a month, right? And it just sits there and it builds upon the knowledge that it has gained, and you find a way to prompt it so that it takes different approaches and it explores the problem space and it goes and it looks at a diverse set of information systems. So if you're asking it a question about agriculture, it also goes into molecular biology and it also goes into economics and it also goes into this. And it just kind of like sits there and recursively tries to solve a problem inside of a specific problem space while exploring universally. The one criticism that I was thinking about with this is that um, these models have yet to uh, find a way to say like, hey, this is actually a good idea, because everything is a good idea to it. You know, you say like XYZ is a good idea, and it's like, ah, this is a good idea. But if you can find a way for it to actually critically validate itself, then you could theoretically let it loose and have it try and find novel
Mm.
information.
I guess the question is like whether they are capable of doing that, or if there's a way like, because I think it's hard to say like with some of the closed source models whether they do have like a single model, or if it's like a single model that like just you have like a branch of other models and it just uses the specific correct model for that use case. Because as far as I'm aware, and I'm not, by no means like up to date on any of the LLM research, it's like it's basically just like predicting the next word, and it does it really well. But it's like if it's predicting a word based on previous words and on statistical sort of probabilities of words, like how probabilistic
Mm.
is it that we'll come up with something that's novel in that case? It may be able to help you search a space because it knows a lot of like, maybe it has got the latest research. It can maybe pry those out. But I'm wondering like to what extent it can come up with like something that's completely new other than just like maybe iterating, commonly known previous, things that it's seen in its data
Mm.
set, right?
I found that like you're correct that that's kind of how a transformer model works. But I found that that's not necessarily a useful way to think about it anymore, because there it does definitely do, I don't want to say novel work, but if you give it a completely new and made up programming language, for instance, and you feed it the documentation for that new programming language, and then you ask it to do something, but do it in that programming language, it can do it, right? Which means that there is some sort of, I hesitate to use the word understanding, but it's the closest thing that we have for what's happening over there, is that it is technically just basic inference under the surface, but as basic inference becomes more and more complex, then you to a certain extent do have intelligence. I mean, you could say as you know uh, biological inference became more intelligent, we ended up with humans at some point, right? Um, and I'm not suggesting consciousness or anything with what I'm saying over here. I'm just saying that I do think that it is possible to come up with novel information if we think of novel information as being the joining of disparate pieces of information that we hadn't made the connections to yet.
Yeah. I think that where there maybe is a value where it like connects certain pieces of information. I guess maybe if you had like endless amounts of compute, maybe you would find like a permutation of all the different fields, and you'd have the question and you say like first question, like what has this got to do with that field? Or what has this got to do with that field? And you just do that like for all permutations of like, social science, like physics, like maths and like chemistry. And you basically go through each one and you accumulate like almost like a intermediate step of all that information. And then you're like, okay, well, can you combine this into a summary that maybe has something informationally interesting about it? I guess maybe it would lead into like information theory and some of those other things. But I don't have any clue about those kind of things.
So I wonder how many discoveries, and I use the word discovery very lightly over here, but let's take, for instance, you're a researcher researching something in molecular biology again, and you are heavily using an LLM to help you reason through data analysis and help you make connections. Is when you do come to a conclusion about this, obviously you're going to validate and you're going to think hard about it and you're going to cross-reference it if you're a good researcher. But in the end, you're going to publish that as your own research. You're not going to say, "Hey, this was all, ChatGPT. Look at the novel connection that it has made." So I do suspect that there have been novel discoveries, if minor, that have happened that are attributed to researchers, but certainly assisted by AI.
Yeah. Just to kind of like head towards tying it up, I guess, do you think there's going to be, do you think, I mean, there's obviously a lot of like a shift from the agents doing work to us just like becoming like we're helping the agent to us being verifiers of the work. Like, I guess the question is like, is our future going to just be us verifying the work that an a agent has done? Or like, do you, I mean, maybe to put a time span on it, like what time span do you think it's going to be where we can have completely autonomous machines, given like,
Yeah,
your knowledge of the space and like, I guess, technology wise, we know programming a little bit. Like, is it going to be like, 5 years, 10 years before we have a fully autonomous like thing doing? I mean, maybe certain domains it's easier, but what's your take on when
I
we're going to have fully
think
autonomous?
that with the current stage of state-of-the-art models, they are knowledge-wise already more competent than, the 95% of people. Um, so what kind of makes humans useful? And I kind of hate to say this because I want humans to be valuable, right? Um, but is our ability to interface with a bunch of different things. So if you have a piece of work that can happen entirely within the constraints of a system, whether that's connected to the internet or not, I think we're already, and a brilliant example of this is programming, right? We are already seeing agentic workflows like Claude Code and people using it to pretty incredible effect where it does go and it does do stuff autonomously, right? It can do stuff currently yeah, you still kind of need a programmer to verify it, et cetera, et cetera. But there are many cases of people going and setting up entire companies that are all the code is AI generated. And yes, it is guided by a human, but I think it's going to be a very short period of time before, the agent comes up with the idea, executes on it, etc. Um, Now, I was reading another interesting take by someone who's building some of these platforms, and he said that one of the main problems over here is that let's assume that an AI system is incorrect or hallucinates 2% of the time, right? 5% of the time, depending on what they're working on, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you have, you know, two steps, it's very unlikely that it's going to hallucinate. If you have five steps, however, the chance that it hallucinates compounds, right? And with that, the errors compound on top of each other. Now, if you have 20 steps, mathematically, there is going to be a hallucination and it is going to build on top of itself and it is going to become confused. And so until we can very reasonably have a super, super low level of hallucinations or incorrect information or the ability for it to fact check itself very well, it mathematically can't build something completely autonomously. And I mean, you could say the same thing about humans, but at least we have the ability to fact check ourselves very well. And so that's kind of why we still need human guidance of these systems for something like programming. But I don't see that being a necessity for very long, to be honest.
I don't know. I think it's like I think I saw like a some chat about are the AIs just being are they just very good at deceiving us, right? Because for instance, you could like I think of like the vibe coders, right? They're like, vibe code me this, and like they go onto the website and like, yeah, it's like the button, click this, and it works. But you don't know that in the background it's like actually connecting to like some back-end system and like hacking, your neighbor, right? So the thing is like from the outside it would look like it's working, but from the system's perspective, you're unable to tell. Obviously, you can like do like network controls and stuff like that, but you wouldn't know that it's doing specifically anything nefarious unless you like have some ability to go deeper into the code, and maybe you will have more systems that just verify code and make sure that it's like completely safe. Um, but maybe I think people's sense of being a little bit more safe on the safe side will keep us, with, it's at
Perhaps.
least there'll be like a technical guy who's in charge of the AI, before it's just like an AI that does everything.
Well, so I played around with Claude quite a bit over the past couple of months. Sorry, not with Claude, with Cursor, and I've actually ended up uninstalling Cursor and canceling my subscription, and I'm back to just you know coding everything by hand, or at least I never stopped doing that for projects that are important, like Bear. Um, but I actually found that I was spending a lot of time doing just manual back and forth between me and the chat box, and but my brain would be turned off. So I'd say do this, and then it would do something, and then I would disengage, and I'd be reading something else or thinking about something else, and then it would be finished. And I'd go and I'd take a look at it, and I'd say, oh yeah, just change that and that and that. And then I'd go and I'd do something else while it thinks about that. And so in doing that, I actually found that the amount of time I was spending per task was longer, and I was also not engaged with my work. So that's two negatives over there. All right, I would much prefer for the task to be shorter and for me to be engaged with my work. Um, and so I just decided that that's not a way that I want to work.
I think the first thing is like Lex Freeman did a chat with DHH, which is quite good, and he's got a very similar approach. My other kind of concern or like thing about the agent space is like at some point you need to start to like who do you really trust as an agent sort of operator, right?
Yeah, I
Because
get that.
Cursor, like you don't know if Cursor's got in their prompt, like every now and again, just subtly inject a bit of a bug so that you then have to use more tokens to correct the bug. And so I think, I mean, I'm not, conspiracy theorist, but if I was a business looking to make money, I wouldn't be necessarily excited about having. I mean, it's like this game theory. Like, do I want to have like the best AI in the game and like, become better than everyone else, or do I just want to make a little bit more money and maybe I'll not be so good at making an efficient model that gets the code done in like real quick time. And that's where I start to think, business interests versus human interests is maybe misaligned.
I think at the end of the day, we're going to do what we've done for centuries, and we're going to have to audit the businesses to make sure that they don't take advantage of the consumer.
Or yeah, there's going to have to be some sort of legal process to make sure you're not, yeah, being anti-competitive or, doing nefarious things. But yeah, I think this has been a good conversation. I
I
think
think so too. You've given me a bunch of stuff to think about. Generally, like I get to the end of a chat with you and I'm like, cool, I think we like rounded out that conversation really well, but now I'm like gonna go home and do some
phase,
reading.
get ready for phase two, man.
Get ready for phase two. Take care of yourself.
Yeah, cheers.